we can bring in Rana Mitter here, who's chair of the US-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Rana, thanks very much for speaking to us this evening. You will have heard from our correspondent then touching on the fact that this year's theme, if you like, is the role of science, technology and innovation. There's already been talk of the discrepancy between access to those things in the developing world and, of course, the developed world. What do you make of that? How central is that issue in your view?
I think it's very central, Michelle, and it's one of the areas where China, the major actor at this conference, is really, I think, going to make its mark. It's worth remembering, as you've said in the report, that China is not a member of the G77, but it regards itself as a very close ally. And what China is saying is that when it comes to economic development, science and technology are at the forefront, and China is definitely in possession of the kind of technologies that the G77 countries will need. One example of that would be 5G, which is central to the way in which Wi-Fi and telecommunications generally need to be taken off the traditional landlines and essentially made accessible to all. That's something that China has done at home, and it would argue it can do for other countries too. The other example is solar energy. As countries need to move past fossil fuels, get towards the net zero agenda, that's again somewhere where China, as a major global producer of solar panels, feels that it can offer something to the G77. So science and the commerce that comes from it, central to this argument.
You've touched on two central points there, Rana. 134 developing nations taking part in this summit. The idea is ultimately to reach a consensus on bridging the gap between the developing world and the developed world. I mean, how difficult or simple is that likely to be with that many countries kind of weighing in on the debate?
I think that clearly there's going to be no consensus. That would be impossible with 134 countries. And there's also two different strands, ideological strands, you might say, that are either implicitly or explicitly going to be part of the discussion. Those are basically the countries that are not really allied either with the United States or with China in terms of orientation. They just want to get the best deal for themselves in terms of trying to improve their economy or expand their global trade. The other part is the countries that actually do feel active resentment against the West. Now, China is, of course, the leading country in that category. Russia, which isn't present in quite the same way, but nonetheless out there, of course, is another one which is very keen to try and push back against what it regards as the American-dominated world order. And the location of this conference, Cuba, is significant in that respect. Cuba still does not have full diplomatic relations with the United States, and there's no doubt that the Havana government feels that it's been in many ways very badly treated by the Americans, while the Americans still argue that human rights abuses mean that it doesn't want to open that full sort of relationship with Cuba. So I think those sorts of strands about the roles of the United States are really at the heart of where some divisions may lie in the discussion.
I mean, can we expect an anti-American rhetoric or tone to emerge from this? Is that inevitable, given, as you say, the countries that don't necessarily share the same Western narrative?
I think that we'll see it in a muted form. Some countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and other countries in the region which feel resentful against the United States, from them we probably will hear some quite active rhetoric about how Washington is too dominant. You won't get it from the majority of the countries, largely because they don't really want to have an element of being on one side or the other in a new kind of conflict. They want economic development, and rather, as the Secretary General of the United Nations has pointed out, dealing with climate change, dealing with a whole variety of other issues that are global, trying to prevent the next pandemic. We shouldn't forget we're only a year and a half out of the first phase of the acute COVID pandemic. These are things that for most of them will be much more in mind, particularly since that comment about the Cuban vaccine that Mr. Guterres made is a wider indication to remind people that the next pandemic, we don't know when it is, we hope it's a long time away, but at some point it will come back and cross-global efforts will be needed. That's much more what the G77 is about, I think.
Rana, we've just got time for a final question for you. I want to come back to Beijing and their presence at this G77 summit. Again, they're not a member, but have kind of been behind it. How important, I should say, is Beijing's support at a summit like this?
It's mutual, Rochelle. On the one hand, yes, it is important that Beijing is offering assistance, particularly through its private sector in terms of providing economic development. But Beijing also needs this group of influential countries, 77 countries plus, in fact, rather more now, to actually state that Beijing has a legitimate place in the wider world, and it's not just about the West. So both sides need each other.
Okay, on that note, Rana Mitter, your chair in US-Asia relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Always good to speak to you, Rana. Thanks so much.